Welcome to Spotlight. The effects of poverty, race, and opportunity on America's schools are major issues confronting educational reform. Joining us to discuss these issues are Dr. Eric Cooper, founder and president of the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education, and Dan Domenech, executive director of the American Association of School Administrators. Welcome. Dan, how would you like schools to address the issues of poverty and racial inequality? What would you like to see happening?
We have an administration that has allocated the largest amount of dollars to the public school system ever. Out of that $800 billion stimulus package, $100 billion went to education. Now, you would think that with that kind of influx of resources, the schools should be out there celebrating. But what happened is that $100 billion did not come to the schools on top of, but it wound up replacing another $100 billion. $100 billion that would have been contributed by the states and by the localities, which the states and localities withdrew when they knew the federal dollars were coming in. So consequently, it wasn't even a zero-sum game. It wound up being a negative for districts who wound up with less money than they had before. We just finished doing a study that shows that this coming school year, 275,000 education jobs are going to be lost, and that is going to have a significant impact on class size.
Right.
And that's going to further reduce the very programs that have been put in place the last couple of years to close the achievement gap and to affect the higher achievement on the part of the students of poverty that we're talking about. So we're going in the wrong direction.
How are you going to keep students, re-engage them and their parents in their school community? How are you going to keep them focused on going to school every day?
Well, first of all, there is an individual responsibility for achievement. The student, the family does have a responsibility. What my heart goes out to the mother who in communities challenged by poverty, who has 2 or 3 jobs. She gets up at the crack of dawn, gets back after the kids have been put to sleep. Poverty affects how well she's able to parent. I have never met a parent in any community, some of the poorest communities in this nation, who doesn't ultimately care. And that mother should be viewed as a hero in terms of what she's able to provide. At the same time, this is what then we need as a society to recognize that there is also an institutional responsibility, as Dan was saying, that when that mother is not able to be there and after school, we have got to find the funds that support the extended day in a manner that really does support those families that are challenged by poverty. So our job, I believe, as educators, and the community's responsibility is picking up and providing that safety net for those kids who we have called our school dependent. They are dependent on that school because that mother has 2 or 3 jobs, or there is a problem in poverty that is facing that family. We need to step up our commitment to them, and we need to broaden what we think about in terms of policy as not only just selecting a school such as the charter schools, and there's some really good charter schools, but also developing those schools in a manner that really builds on what is the largest resource available to America in terms of schools. And what is that? We have 3.7 million Americans who are educators in this country. We need to begin to think about more broadly how we proceed with education reform from an articulated process that really starts in the classroom, engages the school, engages the community, and begins to tie into those national policies that we know that can accelerate change for kids, taking it to scale. You cannot take it to scale without the support of 3.7 million educators, period. It won't happen. I know you would agree with that, Dan.
And Dan, the AASA's legislative agenda calls for a refocusing of the federal role in education on low-income and minority children, focusing federal dollars where they are needed most on schools, focusing on children of poverty, significantly increases the chances that those dollars will help to close the achievement gap. How can that be accomplished?
The focus clearly needs to be on children of poverty, and the federal dollars need to go to those schools in those areas where the children are lacking in terms of the resources that are available to them. That's why it's so important for us to see that education is funded at the federal level on a basis that recognizes the need, because it really isn't. You know, when we see that in addition to poverty, the zip code is a better predictor of student achievement. Because if you happen to live in an affluent community, the students in those schools are performing way up there.
Right.
Whereas if you're in the South Bronx, or if you're in DC, or if you're in areas of poverty, and you look at the schools and the performance in that area, and then what are all the factors that are part of that? Well, you have teachers whose pay is lower, you have teachers with less experience, and you have teachers who, if they are proficient and they are effective, leave because they're hired by the suburban school district that can offer them higher salaries. So poverty really plays a prevailing factor behind all of these effects. So it's really the responsibility then of the federal government to level the playing field by ensuring that the resources go where the resources are needed.
Do you see the funding structure changing anytime soon, barring another lawsuit?
Well, that's what we're concerned about. That's what we want to make sure, that Title I dollars remain not competitive, but entitlement in terms of going to the children that need the funds, and that we don't divert from that.
Let me shift that in terms of your question a bit, okay? You use the term that we've been trying to advocate for Americans to begin to understand that it's the wrong terminology. You use the term minority. In the very near future, this country will be changing from majority white to majority people of color. So I think we have got to start thinking about our own self-interest in the standpoint of, if this is going to be a majority people of color nation, which it is becoming. I mean, I think U.S. Census says 2042, 2047, something like that, if my memory, if I recall correctly. We have got to realize that it is in the best interest of every single American that all Americans people succeed. And that's why when we at the National Urban Alliance argue for value-directed policy that is data-driven, there's a shift in the framing, because we recognize what's coming down in terms of the demographic shift. But you also realize, in saying value-directed education, we're basically implying that let's embrace the value that makes America great. And America never gives up on its people. That's one of its values. We can't give up on anybody. We can't decide that it's better to spend $40,000 approximately in a bed in a prison versus $20,000 or $18,000 for early childhood, where we can get a real strategic bang for that. And we have got to realize that after early childhood, the work doesn't stop there. We have got to find ways of supporting K-12 in a manner that serves the best interest of America, not some Americans versus another. We're not arguing for reallocation of resources, not at all. We're arguing for the American dream, and that value is based upon providing opportunity. If a person is willing to work hard, we should be there as a nation to support that person in spite of the challenges that they have in terms of family circumstances, poverty, and other issues. And if we could become less a colorblind society and more a colorful society, recognize the beauty that we all bring to the experience and how little there is that separates us. If we could begin to change the framing of how we view ourselves, of what is America and what is American, we can begin that dialogue, that conversation, those courageous conversations that people like Glenn Singleton bravely talk about, that really helps us understand that race and poverty still is a major challenge in America. And we have to direct our attention to embracing those courageous conversations while modeling and demonstrating that every single child is capable of learning and achieving at the highest rate if we give them that opportunity and we guide them appropriately.
How does that trickle down to the teachers and the students and the parents?
Well, first of all, we don't trickle down. I think that philosophy and economic thinking has not worked. Trickle down,
Poor choice of words.
That's
right.
We have got to be, as I said, we have got to create in our policies a more horizontal understanding of what is the best way to enter in our support in terms of our funding. And the best way, which is strategic, is through the teacher. In the context of all those programs that we know are working, as Dan was talking about before, but recognizing that the principal is key in a school. So if we begin to rethink how we work, and we realize that the single most important factor is in schools, our teachers, then we build strategically on where that is so that we don't continue to see that loss of human capital, that waste of human capital that is existing. I cry because I know some kids who were able to rise up out of those highly financially challenged communities and graduate from really good schools. They used to have to crawl. I know kids when we were working with children and students in Indianapolis where they had to crawl to school, through broken glass to avoid gunshots. But they got into that school, and that school was an oasis for them. It provided them support. And when they met a teacher who, in those circumstances, just happened to be white, who embraced them in terms of their capacity to learn, those children succeeded. And they got out of special ed. They got into colleges. They're now poets. They're now doctors. I mean, we've been at this long enough, Dan, that we've been able to see some of these changes coming along. And I think what is critical is that we have got to change belief by providing hope. And if we change belief by providing hope, something happens with the brain that enables it to grow. And it becomes more determined. The learner becomes determined. And the learner becomes confident. And that's transcendent in terms of its value as it relates to what we've talked about before in terms of values-directed, data-driven policy initiatives in America.
Dan, how can superintendents support teachers in the classroom to do just that?
Well, that's exactly what superintendents do. Their primary role is to provide that support, to make sure that the teachers have what they need to do the job, to make sure that they have the kind of professional development and opportunities that give them the skills to be able to work with these children. I think one of the big issues that we see in situations like this is that when we talk about equity, people interpret equity as saying we give every child the same thing. And that is totally not the case. Equity is that we give each child what each child needs. And it's very clear that children of poverty have needs that are very different from the children that are not. They require more time. They require a different method of instruction. They require more time on task than other children do. And teachers that have to be trained to be able to work well with these youngsters. These youngsters respond better to the individual attention of teachers. That's why smaller class sizes is so critical for these youngsters. And you can have an AP or an honors class with 35 youngsters in it who are sitting there, who are attentive, who are answering the questions of the teacher. You can't have 35 children that are underachievers, low performing, that have difficulty reading, that have attention deficit disorder. You can't have that. You need a smaller group of youngsters working with teachers that are attentive to their needs, that individualize instruction, that are willing to spend time with them before school, after school, one-on-one. And this is what makes the big difference. So that's where the superintendents come in.
Dan also did not force his teachers to teach the test. So the focus was not on fragmented, atomistic approaches to learning those specific skills to pass a test. It was about learning the deep critical thinking skills, the problem solving, the decision making within the content area in a way that got kids excited about learning. That's a superintendent's role, getting in front of that parade and making sure that drum major is out in front and bringing along the other people who are playing the wonderful instruments so that rather than a cacophony, we get a blending that really is focused on student-centered needs geared toward helping America maintain the beauty that is our democracy.
Eric and Dan, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
joining us on Spotlight.
You're welcome.
Thank you.